Donovan, I don't even know how to begin this, but I've been a longtime viewer of your YouTube channel, and I know you cover a lot of strange, often suppressed incidents. I'm reaching out because I believe you're one of the few people who will actually listen without writing me off as a liar or a crank. I'm not exactly proud to be speaking about this, and I'm pretty certain it puts me in an awkward position if anyone in my former circles were to find out. But here it goes, because my conscience keeps gnawing at me. This is the full account of an operation that went bad, though bad doesn't quite capture the magnitude. This happened about a decade ago now, 2012 specifically, in the southwestern part of Colombia, near the Putumayo region, not terribly far from the tri-border area around Leticia. Let me backtrack a bit because I guess you need context, though. I used to be in the Army. Then I transitioned into more specialized communications work that was attached unofficially to various agencies. The sort where your badge is no badge at all, if that makes sense. My job was basically to operate and monitor secured comms for small squads, tasked with missions that were not always on the official books. Sometimes we worked in tandem with local authorities, but more often we were out there on our own, typically chasing leads that tied into narco-trafficking or paramilitary actions. But every so often, the line between a purely drug interdiction mission and something else, something more intangible, would blur. We'd get briefings that didn't quite add up. We'd be given references to dangerous wildlife that were clearly not typical jungle animals, or mentions of sightings that, on the surface, sounded like local folklore. But no one in our chain of command ever wanted to talk about that stuff directly. They'd just say to keep the lines open and keep them posted on all radio transmissions. During 2012, we were running an operation out of a forward base near Orito, in the department of Putumayo. It's thick jungle terrain out there, beautiful in its own wild way, but unbelievably difficult if you're not used to the climate and the environment. The humidity alone can knock the wind out of you if you're not adequately prepped. Our role was to coordinate with a half-dozen local assets. Some were Colombian Army specialists, and some were from our side. The group was maybe 8 guys total, though it varied from day to day, who would go deeper into the jungle to gather intel, disrupt FARC-affiliated labs, and so on. Officially, that was the mission: gather intelligence on rebel activity and locate hidden labs. But off the record, the rumor floating around was that they were investigating some phenomenon that villagers had been reporting. People in the outer municipalities had apparently claimed to see shadowy creatures, man-sized or bigger, lurking near the edges of farmland. Now at first, we all thought this was just superstition, or maybe a wildcat or a big dog. You'd hear rumors of a dogman, or some monstrous wolf-like entity that would appear out of nowhere. Or sometimes they'd tell you it was a bruja, some shape-shifting witch from local folklore. In the States, that sounds outlandish. But when you're in the thick of the Amazon, you can't help but get caught up in the local tales. Usually, the official line is that it's narco soldiers spooking the locals so they don't wander near hidden labs, or it's a big cat, or maybe even a local paramilitary tactic. But we got word from a few people on the ground that something else was spooking entire villages. People would vanish while out hunting, or farmers would discover half their livestock gone, like something huge had carried them off. No footprints or tracks to speak of, just big swaths of flattened foliage. The strangest detail was that a few local farmhands, who had apparently survived some kind of encounter, told the same story. They heard a low, guttural growl first, then saw a pair of eyes in the darkness. Now, me personally, I didn't put much stock in that rumor. I spent enough time in the Army to know that local legends can get inflated, and when you're deep in the jungle, your senses can betray you. But I do remember noticing that our higher-ups seemed more interested than usual in these stories, like, uncomfortably interested. They pressed for specifics in the field reports, asked us if there were any patterns with these sightings. Our intelligence guys, who normally only cared about how many labs were in an area, how many rifles, that sort of thing, suddenly started asking about these large creatures and where they might be dens. Then we got new gear, odd gear. The squad was issued advanced thermal optics, not just standard issue, but top-of-the-line stuff I'd never even seen stateside. It was the kind you'd use if you were trying to track a hidden heat signature in dense undergrowth. They also got special acoustic triangulation devices, presumably so they could pinpoint the exact location of a growl. No one came out and said that, but that's basically what it was for. They just said, "We want to be able to locate hostiles with advanced stealth tactics." That was the official reasoning, at least. I remember the day the team set off for the deeper insertion. It was mid-April, and the weather was, surprisingly, not too rainy, though the humidity was still a killer. They were heading south of Orito, approaching the Ecuadorian border. We had a small forward outpost, nothing fancy, just a couple of tents, a makeshift wooden structure for some supply storage, and an antenna rig for comms. I was manning the primary console in that outpost, basically relaying all communications to the next level up. The mission was standard infiltration at first. They planned a 3-day recon. The location was rumored to be a site for a hidden lab, but also, supposedly, there had been sightings of these large bipedal canine creatures. Some of the local campesinos swore they were basically giant wolves that could walk upright. The men joked about it before heading out, except for one local Colombian army sergeant who said his grandmother believed in something called hombre lobo, a sort of werewolf legend that ran deep in certain parts of Latin America. But we mostly shrugged it off. They made contact regularly for the first 2 days. All transmissions were normal. They'd found some evidence of FARC presence, maybe a few trails that indicated contraband movement, but nothing extraordinary. No labs, no dog-like creatures, the usual stuff. The men sounded bored, to be frank, and I remember that I told them we'd resupply them if they needed to extend the mission. They replied that they'd be fine. They had enough MREs to hold them. On the morning of the 3rd day, they radioed in that they'd found a cave system. This was not unusual in that area. There are plenty of rocky outcroppings and hidden caverns, though it's not widely known. They said they wanted to investigate because they caught a strong heat signature near the entrance when they were scanning with their thermals the night before. They suspected it might be a small rebel encampment inside. They planned to approach it in the late afternoon, and that's the last time they sounded calm and methodical. Early that same morning, about an hour after their normal check-in, I got a weird call from someone up the chain, someone I rarely heard from, a man with a stateside accent who asked me very pointed questions about the men's location. He wanted to know if they'd made contact with any indigenous species. I asked him what he meant, because the men only reported the usual local fauna. He then told me to forward all transmissions immediately to a separate secure line if they mentioned anything unusual. I confirmed, albeit hesitantly. Something about the man's tone was off. It was as if he was less concerned about the men and more concerned about the possibility of encountering whatever it was he was referencing. So that set me on edge. This wasn't normal. Normally, if we find a lab or have a skirmish, we just relay that info up. No reason to route it through a special secure line. But I complied. By mid-afternoon, the men checked in, said they were heading into the cave system. They described a wide entrance with a slope downward that seemed partially man-made, like someone had widened the entrance so it'd be easier to move inside. The temperature in that region is always hot, but they said once they got near the mouth of the cave, the air felt cooler, almost damp, which again can be normal in caves, but they stressed it was an unnaturally chilling dampness. They were also picking up movement on the thermals, but faint, like something was deeper in, occasionally peeking at them from around a bend. They assumed it was rebels who knew they were being followed. They told me they'd proceed with caution. I said I'd stand by. I wish now that I'd told them to turn back, to wait for backup, but that wasn't my call. They outranked me in the operational sense, and the mission was greenlit from higher up. So I just sat there, wearing my headset, listening to them give updates. They moved in single file, scanning the walls. At some point, I heard one of them mention that it smelled foul inside, like rotting animal carcasses. Another said that the floor was scattered with bones, but they couldn't tell if they were from goats, wild pigs, or something else. They even found some that looked suspiciously human, but I'm not sure if that was ever confirmed. Then they started hearing noises from deeper in the cave, grunting, shuffling, and what a couple of them described as a deep growl. This was the first time I heard real concern in their voices. One of the older guys, a staff sergeant from our side, said it sounded like no wildcat he'd ever encountered. He'd served in Afghanistan, had run into all kinds of wildlife in various deployments, but this shook him, you could tell. He said it was deeper, more resonant, and it echoed strangely in the narrow passage. They pressed on anyway. Maybe that was their training, or maybe a stubborn sense of duty. The local Colombian soldier said something about it possibly being the legendary Hombre Lobo. He was half joking, but half not. The others brushed it off and told him to keep quiet. Then, for several minutes, I just heard footsteps on stone, hushed breathing. The tension in the line was palpable. They were scanning with their thermals, but the feed was spotty. I heard one of them mention seeing a large shape moving behind a rock formation. Then there was a moment of confusion. They said it disappeared off the thermal as if it wasn't there. Then it reappeared on the other side of the passage. They were spooked, to say the least. Right about then, I got an urgent ping from that same stateside contact, asking me if the men had encountered any entities. That was the word he used, entities. I found that choice of words alarming. I told him they'd encountered something, but we didn't know what. I heard him sigh heavily. Then he said to remain on the line, that they were dispatching an emergency extraction team if the men needed it. Then he hung up. Back in the cave, the men kept whispering about movement. They'd see flickers of heat, catch a silhouette, then it would vanish. Something was toying with them. One man said it looked tall, maybe 7 feet. Another argued it was crouched, that it could be even taller if it stood upright. Then the Colombian soldier said it had a face like a dog or a wolf. He only got a quick glimpse in the flicker of a flashlight. Everyone else told him to shut up and not panic, but they all saw something. That's when they started hearing those growls, more pronounced, echoing from multiple directions. I felt my stomach knot. I was just sitting there, thousands of feet away from them, hearing them go deeper into that darkness. The entire time, I was scanning the radio frequencies, trying to see if there was any chatter from rebels in the area. Nothing. It was dead silent aside from their transmissions. Then I heard the first scream. It wasn't a full scream at first, more like a shouted expletive, as if someone had been startled. Then the squad leader started barking orders to spread out, get a visual. They said something big just darted across the corridor. Another soldier said he saw more than one shape. They were pinned in a narrow passage, not fully sure which direction to go. There was a flurry of movement on the comms. It sounded like they were taking up defensive positions. Then came the staccato bursts of gunfire, short, controlled bursts at first, likely standard procedure to conserve ammo, and see if they can scare off whatever was there. One of them said they saw eyes in the muzzle flash, shining a sickly yellow-green reflection. Then more gunfire. Someone shouted that the bullets didn't seem to be slowing it down. It was so chaotic that I couldn't track who was speaking after a while. The transmissions were overlapping, men talking over each other. All I know is that they were in trouble, and I could hear them yelling for extraction. I was about to radio for a rescue team, but the next thing I heard was a guttural snarl, deeper than anything I'd ever heard over a radio. It vibrated through the earpiece. Then you could hear men screaming in the background. One man came through loud and clear, panting, saying that there were multiple hostiles. He kept calling them things, these things, and he said they were picking the men off. He said he watched one soldier get grabbed and dragged into the darkness. Another soldier said he saw the muzzle flash, reveal something that had a wolf-like head, but long arms, almost like a man, with claws that caught the light. Then gunfire again. The radio feed cracked with static. There were growls, snarls, and the soldiers were screaming, cursing. It was absolute mayhem. Then it went silent, completely silent for a moment. I tried calling out to them by name, by call sign, anything, nothing. The hiss of dead air. That's a sound that still haunts me. I remember just repeating, "Are you there? Do you copy?" over and over. No response. Meanwhile, my hands were shaking. I've heard gunfights before, but this was something else entirely. It sounded more like an ambush by apex predators than a typical firefight. I scrambled to contact the base, to raise the alarm, to request immediate extraction for them. The commanding officer at the base told me they'd look into it, but to remain calm. Not even 15 minutes later, that same stateside contact rung up on the secure line, instructing me to hold all transmissions and not to speak of it to anyone. The strange part was that within an hour, a team of American contractors arrived by helicopter at our outpost. Guys I'd never seen before, decked out in gear with no insignia. They took over the station, basically pushed me aside. They started scanning for signals, presumably from the men's radio. They told me they'd handle it. I tried to protest, but one of them told me to keep quiet if I valued my job. All night, I stuck around to see if there was any sign of the squad. Nothing. The new guys were intercepting random pings on the men's channel, but it was all garbled. Sometimes you'd hear a faint moan or a weird growl, or maybe that was just the static playing tricks on us. Eventually, they just packed up their gear at dawn and left. No word to me about what they found. I asked if we were sending a rescue party. They said not to worry about it. That was that. Of course, I worried about it. I asked some of the local Colombian soldiers if they'd heard anything. They just shook their heads, gave me that look like they knew something bigger was going on, but didn't dare speak. A day later, I was informed the mission was concluded and that the squad had fallen off the grid. Officially, the statement that trickled down was that the men died in a helicopter crash, except they never boarded a helicopter that night. We all knew that was bogus, but that's what the final report said. They told me to keep my mouth shut. That's basically the short version, though I realize I've rambled quite a bit here. I can't get the sound of those growls and the men's final screams out of my head. Over the years, I've tried to bury it. Told myself maybe it was a pack of wild animals, a freak occurrence. But then I remember the confusion in the men's voices when they said the bullets weren't stopping these things, or the stateside contacts pointed questions about entities. It all adds up to something else, something the higher-ups knew we might encounter. I first want to say I've never shared this in such detail before, mainly because I've spent the better part of my life being told to keep my head down and my mouth shut. But over the last few months, I've been feeling like my silence is more of a disservice than anything else. I've prayed on this, considered it every which way, and I still come to the same conclusion. I need to get it off my chest. I served as an Army chaplain from 1987 until I took my retirement in early 2010. Most folks think my biggest job was giving sermons, officiating weddings, or providing comfort in tough times. But in truth, I spent more nights kneeling beside soldiers, listening to confessions and secrets that weighed heavier than any rucksack they carried. It's strange how I can still remember the smell of dust and sweat in the old canvas tents as clearly as my own living room. Let me backtrack a bit, because I'm sure none of this will make much sense without a bit of context. In the early 1990s, I was stationed at Fort Campbell in Kentucky, 101st Airborne. I remember walking the perimeter at night, hearing night training exercises, the blacked-out helicopters overhead, those rotor blades beating the air in the distance. But it was in 2003, during the early phases of our involvement in Iraq, that I began getting glimpses into things so beyond normal that I still wonder if it really happened. The first time a soldier came to me about something unnatural, they were trembling like I'd only seen in brand new recruits after their first live fire exercise. At the time, I chalked it up to the stress of combat. Maybe seeing the horrors of war had unhinged him a bit. The confessions usually revolved around guilt or fear. I'd hear, "I can't live with what we did out there," or "I'm ashamed of what I saw and didn't report." But then, around late 2006, stationed at Bagram Airfield in Afghanistan, I had soldiers come into my makeshift chapel quietly, boots scraping the gritty floor, eyes darting around to make sure no one was listening. One young specialist, he was with a reconnaissance unit, seemed like a decent kid from Montana. He starts telling me that on one patrol they saw these silhouettes in the mountains. But these weren't just silhouettes of normal fighters. They had wings. Wings, he repeated, though not in so many words. He never said it exactly. It was just implied with gestures and descriptions. If you've ever seen a man on the edge of tears but trying to hold it together, you know how desperate he can look. I didn't believe him at first. Tried to comfort him. Told him maybe it was just exhaustion from the high altitude. But then, within the next few weeks, 2 other soldiers from a completely different platoon came to me with nearly identical stories. They were part of a forward observation group near the Khyber Pass, living on rations and sleeping in shifts. Some nights they said they'd hear flapping overhead, like giant leather wings, and see these fleeting shapes crossing in front of the moonlight. They'd try to rationalize it. Maybe it was just large desert birds or bats. But they said the shapes were bigger, far bigger than any bird they'd ever seen back home. I remember a specific incident in 2007, springtime I think, because the desert was just starting to warm up again, though nights were still cold. We got an urgent call to provide counsel to a group of soldiers who'd returned from a classified mission along the border region. I wasn't allowed to ask specifics, but they told me enough for me to piece together a general idea. They'd been sent to investigate some remote cave systems, which local villagers insisted were haunted or cursed. Usually, the army might humor local superstitions if it also had tactical value, kind of a kill 2 birds with 1 stone approach. The cave system might have hidden insurgents, weapons caches, whatever. So they go do their job. What they ended up finding apparently drove some of them half mad. One soldier, a sergeant from Alabama, confided to me that he'd put 3 rounds into something that wasn't a man and wasn't an animal, only to have it keep moving toward him. He used phrases like, "It towered over me," and "it had wings on its back." And at some point, he must have realized how insane he sounded, because he stopped mid-sentence and looked down at his hands, shaking as if he were freezing. Another soldier said they had to carry out a wounded comrade, but the wounds weren't consistent with bullets. I distinctly recall an offhand comment that the injuries looked more like claws or talons had caused them. That entire mission was quickly shut down. Commanding officers told everyone involved not to breathe a word about it. I was essentially given a hush order as well, though it was phrased more politely. Security concerns and the mental welfare of the troops. In the military, I learned real quick when they say for security concerns. It might be code for there's more to this than meets the eye. The chaplain corps, though, was always in a strange position. We had a responsibility to keep confessions private. So I followed orders on the outside, but inside, I was troubled. You spend your entire adult life believing the chain of command, the army structure. Then you see that chain used to hide something so bizarre. Your mind struggles to process it. As time passed, and we rotated units in and out of Afghanistan, I kept hearing rumors. They circulated among the NCOs who spent extended tours in certain outposts. I'd overhear them quietly talking in MWR tents, or messing around in the chow line, wondering if those flying things were still out there. Some even talked about hearing them shriek at night. One corporal said it was like the scream of a bird of prey, but deeper, more resonant. Others reported massive shadows on the canyon walls. Of course, official reports attribute these sightings to stress, local wildlife, or illusions caused by unfamiliar terrain. In 2008, I was assigned temporary duty to a base near Jalalabad. It's funny the things you remember. That base had the most monotonous chow hall rotations, chicken stew or spaghetti almost every night. While I was there, I got called in by a senior officer and 2 men in civilian clothes, though I was pretty sure they were DIA or CIA, something of that sort. They essentially asked me to keep anything out of my next sermon that would reference morale issues tied to unconfirmed sightings. They even hinted that it would be better if I leaned on the side of telling soldiers to trust the official statements about unknown sightings. That's typical code for tell everyone not to go around repeating nonsense. As a chaplain, I never liked being told what not to say, but I also recognized it as a direct order. They were spooked, though. I could see it in the older man's eyes. Government reps always show up with that polite, measured tone. But if you look closely, especially as a chaplain, you learn to read fear and worry instantly. I guess the biggest confessional moment. and the one that truly convinced me there was more to this than wartime hallucinations, happened just a few months later. A soldier, I still remember the details, a staff sergeant from the 10th Mountain Division, tall, stoic type. It took him a good 20 minutes to even get to the point. He'd encountered something in a ravine during a night reconnaissance. The sergeant and his men were scoping out possible enemy routes. They were using night vision, carefully as usual, making sure they didn't give away their position. They saw what they described as a tall silhouette, perched on the outcropping of a rock formation. It had large membranes on its back, what any normal person would call wings. When they tried to move in closer, it vanished almost instantly. The next day, they found unusual footprints in the dusty ground, 3-toed impressions, bigger than a human foot. He said the men in his squad refused to talk about it after they got back. Officially, they reported no contact, but it was tearing at him because he felt like he had lied under oath. You might ask whether I ever saw anything personally, and that's where this gets complicated. I don't have a dramatic story of my own. I once thought I saw a shape in the sky while traveling between forward operating bases in a Chinook, but it could have been a vulture or an eagle, though to me, it seemed far larger than either. Honestly, I can't confirm or deny my own eyes anymore. After hearing so many confessions, you wonder if your mind might just be playing tricks, forcing you to see something that you expect or dread to see. The strangest part is that outside of a select group of soldiers, intelligence officers, and presumably a few higher-ups in the Pentagon, no one else knows about it. Or if they do, they keep it locked down tight. Over the years, I kept a small notebook, more a personal diary, carefully coded, so that if anyone found it, it would look like ramblings or sermon references. I wrote down each instance a soldier came to me, describing these winged figures. The last entry was in 2009, right before I retired, referencing a soldier from the 82nd Airborne who had some unexplainable night sightings near Kandahar. I retired the next year, and since then, I haven't heard anything else, but I still wonder if it's ongoing and just never sees the light of day. I know how all this sounds. If I hadn't been there, hadn't looked into the eyes of men trained to be fearless, only to see them rattled to their core, I wouldn't believe it either. For a long time, I told myself to just bury it, that the weight was mine to shoulder as a spiritual advisor. But I keep thinking about these men who felt alone in their terror, forced to stay silent. So maybe by laying it all out, I'm giving a voice to them and to my own conscience.